Our mutual aid spotlight for this video is Nader. Nader is a young man who loves his studies very much, and the war in Gaza has completely destroyed his life. His family consists of 7 members, and due to the devastating genocide in the Gaza Strip, their homes were completely destroyed and became uninhabitable. They've been forced to flee to the south and are searching for safety. They've been displaced more than 9 times and continue to suffer from harsh conditions and a severe shortage of food, water, and medical treatment. Nader is in dire need of fundraising to finance his family's travel to a safe country. They ask for our support and assistance in these difficult circumstances and say that even small contributions can make a big difference. Nader thanks us very much for our support and generosity. The campaign is hosted on GoFundMe and will be linked in the video description below. Thank you for your generosity, and free Palestine.
Numinous Productions presents a Jumu'ah conversation with Muslims and TTRPGs.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome. It's wonderful for you all to be here. And I will start by saying that I'm Feiruz, my pronouns are she or they, and I'm really, really excited to see what happens in our conversation today. Who would like to go next?
Sure, I'll take it away. Hello, everyone. My name is Humna, and I use any and all pronouns. And yeah, I'm also really excited to kind of get into this.
My name is Neda and or Amir. I alternate them. Use either at your discretion. And I also use whatever your pronouns are. I don't give a shit, but you can also use they, them for me.
All right, I guess then I will go next. My name is Nairuz, but Naz for short. I also use any and all pronouns, and I'm really excited to get started and meet you all.
So yeah, I'm just gonna kind of launch us in, and whoever wants to answer, please answer. If you don't feel like you care to answer that question, you don't have to, or you don't feel like, you have anything to add or whatever. This is whoever wishes to speak. So one of the things that I would like to ask is, what did being Muslim mean to you growing up?
It's already such a loaded question. And I guess I'll take it. So I didn't necessarily think about people's ages in the context of this panel, but one of my very first core memories was about 9/11. I was 2. So I have a lot of clear memories from that time that I otherwise know nothing about when it comes to my childhood, because it wasn't necessarily a radicalizing point, but it definitely had a seismic shift when it came to being a second-gen American immigrant and realizing as a 2-year-old that it was all built on very shaky foundations to begin with, as many people emigrating to America find out maybe later in life or whatever. I think I grew up very disillusioned with the concept of Christian supremacy as it kind of invaded into Muslim communities in America, because my childhood was very colored by a lot of nationalism, post 9/11 rhetoric that really surged, still till to this day, obviously. So culturally, I think that affected me much more than my individual practice with Islam. I took time to appreciate and go to an Islamic Sunday school, essentially, like a private school, where I learned the basics about language, history, Muslim Islamic modes of thought and rituals. And I definitely appreciated those. And at the same time, as a child, I already found difficulty trying to shift between having just that day of the week for that specific part of me that I was trying to cultivate, and then the rest of trying to exist authentically as a child for the most part. And I didn't really grow out of it either. But in a primarily Christian society that kind of had the appearance of being more progressive as I grew up, because I lived and live in California, where like it's supposedly very progressive, but it doesn't really challenge people in their internal biases when it comes to what it means to care about a nation like America. I hate America, by the way. So we're gonna start off. I'm gonna end my statement there, so I can let someone else go. Yeah.
It's so interesting to hear your experience because I think mine is very different growing up. So kind of similarly, but not similarly, I'm a first generation immigrant in Canada. And for me, I was 5 years old, turning six when 9/11 happened. And honestly, I didn't really like feel the impact of it when I was younger. And I think that is largely due to the fact that I grew up in a very like diverse, it's in a specific demographic kind of way, like neighborhood and area. And so I was constantly surrounded by like different kinds of Asian people. I was surrounded by, my family when we moved to Canada, they found family friends like very quickly. And so I grew up around a whole bunch of other like Pakistani Muslim families similar to mine. And we would spend every weekend at each other's houses. We would rotate whose houses we would go to, have dinner, hang out, that kind of thing. And then even at school, right, all of my friends were brown or other kinds of Asian. And so I honestly grew up with white people being a minority, and I grew up around a diversity of like religions and stuff. So in my experience, I was like, yes, I had Christian friends, but I also had like Hindu friends and like all kinds of other, like some friends who didn't have religions in their households and things like that. So I think really for me, I didn't really feel it as a kid very much. And it wasn't until I got to undergrad that I started to really feel the tensions of like living in a post 9/11 world, because that's when I went to university and all of a sudden I was in like situations where there were a lot more white people around and I was like, what is going on? I like to think I actually had a pretty nice environment to grow up in that way. But it's kind of interesting because for me, Netta, you described like you were really trying to like cultivate this like Muslim part of yourself growing up. And for me, I actually was kind of trying to do the opposite. I didn't actually like being Muslim growing up because I grew up in a very like conservative Muslim household. And to me, it felt more like an inconvenience and an imposition more than anything else, right? It was, my mother sitting us down to like teach us how to read the Quran and like nagging us to like read namaz and like all of these things, right? And so for me as a child, like these were things I didn't understand, like why we were doing them or what was the point. And to me, it just felt like a chore that you had to do, and I didn't quite understand what was the point. And I think that really largely comes as a fault of like how I was taught about the religion growing up, right? Like for me, it was always just coming from a place of both fear and obligation, right? It was a lot of like, well, Allah says you have to do this, so you do. You just do. You don't ask questions, you just have to do it. And then the other flip side of it is, and if you don't, you're going to hell, right? Like, so that, like, as a kid, I'm like, that's not very compelling to me as a reason to do these things. And so for me, really, it was more so like I'm participating in this to appease my parents rather than like any true relationship I had with the religion. And I honestly think I wasn't really in an environment that was like encouraging me to like develop my own personal relationship to the religion at all either. So that was kind of, I think, hindering the process for me. The only really part of like being Muslim that I liked growing up, for some reason, I don't really understand why, was I really liked Ramzan. Like not just Eid, because I know everybody loves Eid, because you get to eat and party afterwards, but like for some reason I also really liked the like month leading up to it, which is odd to say because you're like, why would you like not eating? But but for me, I don't know, there was something about Ramzan I always really enjoyed as a child. Maybe because it was a challenge, maybe because it felt like a way to like truly like engage in some sort of like self-discipline, but also I really liked the like communal aspects of like iftar and to a certain extent seri, but I kind of hate that because I don't like waking up early. And like even to this day, I think that's like the one practice I like try to hold still in my adult life is trying to participate as well as I can in Ramzan in particular. But outside of that, I think for me, like growing up, I just like tried to not so much like fully distanced, but like I didn't really engage very heavily with the religion very much growing up.
I think it's like really interesting hearing you guys' experiences because I feel like I had kind of like a mix of those experiences myself, though I think my experience was really different because so I grew up in the United States up until maybe like the fifth grade. So I was like in the first grade, I guess, when 9/11 happened. But also like you mentioned, Hamna, I didn't really feel like I was aware of it when it happened. I also had a family where we had a lot of, Muslim Arab family friends, and we went to the mosque, and we had an Islamic school that I used to go to. And like it wasn't until I was like older and you kind of sat down with my mom, who is a hijabi, and living in Arizona, which is more conservative than other places in the United States. I feel that she kind of told me about her experiences post 9/11 and how, as a hijabi, like how, her really strictly, religious father was like, you should take off your hijab for the time being. And she just like did not want to do that. But I think then after that, I did move to the Middle East, and living in the Middle East, particularly in Jordan, and that was, a predominantly Muslim country, and living amongst mostly Jordanians, Palestinians who are also Muslim, and living in a really strictly religiously Muslim, Sunni Muslim family, and having that upbringing, it was something that like I did kind of feel a bit trapped in, because you kind of feel like, well, this is what everybody is and this is what you all have to do. But then you kind of have that like same feeling of like you're not allowed to ask questions. But when you're like really young and really curious and you want to know why things are the way that they are, you really want to know these things. But I also feel that I didn't really quite distance myself from religion. More so, I tried to distance myself from, I guess, the opposite of that, of like my culture and things like that, while also holding on to that. I felt as I was growing up, like that spirituality, that mysticism was really important to me. That feeling of like there is like a sort of like, I don't know if I can call it magic that kind of governs the way that life is. And that connection to Allah that kind of is that kind of like secret element that exists in your life when things kind of really get tough and you kind of really want an escape from how things are. And I think in that way that I was able to really, and I really had like some really good religion teachers who kind of tried to make sure that we weren't only thinking of Allah in the terms of like you need to fear him and obey him, but also I think it was something that a teacher really drilled into me, this hadith, I believe, that, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't quite remember it, that Allah loves his creations more than a mother loves her child. And that was something that really stuck with me when I was really little, especially living in such a strict household, that I was like, well, Allah loves me a lot, so I must not be all that bad, And especially like then realizing when I was a teenager that I'm queer, that I'm trans, it's kind of something that I really held on to. Like, no, this was this was supposed to happen because Allah loves me. And so that part of me is really important, I guess. And I never really strayed from it. Now, traditions and customs of Islam, those are things that, those obligations that you have to do, those are things that I find a bit harder to hold on to. Like things like Ramadan is quite easy, but there are other traditions and things that I cannot keep track of and cannot do, but it's something that I'm always trying to improve in and try to kind of watch myself in doing so. But yeah, I think that part of my identity, especially as I got older and met other queer Muslims, was also kind of like a point of community, which is why I really try to hold on to it.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you bring up like leaning into the religion but like moving away from the culture of it all, because like yeah, I feel like for me it was the opposite, where it was like I really leaned into like the culture but I like tried to move away from the religious aspect of it, because I was like, and even today I'm like, my like relationship with Islam is like it's complicated to explain, and I feel like the easiest way to explain it is like probably more cultural than like truly religious at this point. And it's so interesting to like hear kind of like the opposite kind of thing happening for you growing up, because I feel like I didn't really even truly start like coming back to like the spirituality or like the mysticism of it all until like very recently, actually, like until like adulthood. And so like I'm actually in the process of like navigating like what that looks like for myself at the moment, and how that kind of fits in and like maybe doesn't fit in and clashes with sort of the cultural aspects of it. So that's really cool to hear, Naz.
These are such like deeply interesting perspectives to me. My father is Jordanian and my mother is like American. She comes from Louisiana, and that's a very like witchy kind of situation over there. So I had a little bit of a different experience growing up because my mom is Catholic, but I did grow up Sunni Muslim. And so like in addition to being different amongst non-Muslims, I was also different amongst Muslims. And my Arabic is really bad and always has been. So, like, with love, my sibs, the Arabs didn't uh, embrace me maybe the same way that they might have in other conditions. And I'm quite a bit older than y'all. I was in high school when on 9/11. Like I remember like walking down the hall and like hearing people talk about something that had happened and being like, I really hope it wasn't Arabs or Muslims. You know what I mean? So that was a whole thing. But Hamna, something that you said I really want to like come to, which is that in Ramadan, the sense of community is totally different. It's so much more embracing and welcoming. And so that was something that I really like held on to for a long time. Even when I was having, you know, like we're all queer here, so I guess we've all had similar situations where we're like, am I really welcome here? But we'll get into we'll get into the queerness actually pretty much now. So the next thing that I would like to ask is, we're all queer here. Does your queerness and your transness weave together with or hold tension with being Muslim? Yeah, I know.
I can just go first again because I think maybe the underlying obvious answer that's sort of like stereotypical of a queer Muslim's like early transitional life is that there has to be tension culturally, not just because like in a Western dominated lens, Islam is just naturally viewed as a little barbaric, but it's not polite to necessarily say so when people individually identify as such. But one of the things that I respect the most about the Quran is its like unedited, allegedly, nature. So we can refer to a very specific time as well as a very specific place where it stems from. Unfortunately, that does color a lot of, I guess, the difficulties of maybe living with conservative family, because the family unit, when you're specifically a Muslim immigrant, is very vital to your survival, and not being able to trust them potentially with a part of your identity is, of course, heartbreaking. But like from a non-Muslim perspective, it's sort of seen like a choice, like you chose to be Muslim, so you have to like carry this pain. And there's also not a reconciliation with the texts itself. If we want to like get into like the translations about Lut and how queerness is like portrayed, it's obviously not a standard that translates even well to this time, let alone this like political reality. So of course there's like almost a shame in trying to say like I am Muslim and I'm not rejecting that just because I'm queer. And at the same time, I feel like bridging those things together as opposed to claiming Islam separately from being queer makes me look more progressive, because the implication in those two things together is that I've reconciled some sort of dogma that like Islam is inherently homophobic, but I get to be queer. So like I seem more trustworthy to other queer people in that way, which I hate. I actually feel like it's a sort of uniquely American, not like uniquely American, but like a uniquely Western privilege that straight Muslims get to be seen as less progressive by virtue of being straight, because people don't think like they have their internal biases to figure out, or their journeys that like come from an internal sense of self, as opposed to queer Muslims, because the implication is that they struggle to maintain and find them, so their sense of self. So of course, like that is why in a sense I'm like very defensive of being a Muslim, because like these reconciliations, they like we have gotten over sort of the fact that Christians get to have their like progressive sects and churches, despite, you know, this like largely being a homophobic society and all that. They're not nearly as challenged in having to prove themselves as Muslims, because they think of Islam and Christianity as so like apart from each other, which I hate, obviously. But most of the tensions, as you see with a running theme of me, are largely political and have less to do with my internal relationship. So it kind of trivializes my relationship to queerness and Islam, because I feel like I need to focus on like the bigger picture, which is that I like am going to be experiencing pain because of things outside of my control, regardless of how secure I am in myself. And having to deal with that as a teenager moving on, and also not having like an entirely accepting household until I had more control over my life, I feel like is something that a lot of queer teens can relate to, because, you know, the family unit is vital to their life. Like you need to put some faith in like your parents will want the best for you, but obviously conservative households are not unique among Muslim families or whatever, but it hurts when you know why they hold on to their beliefs and they are able to pin it on, you know, their religion, culture, how they grew up. So it takes a lot of maybe like over intellectualizing the self and needing to like be forgiving of other people and their dogmas in order to look inward. I don't get a lot of time to look inward because of that, I feel. And throughout all of that, I still hate being American. And I feel like being American like ties into like a version of queerness that is more palatable to other people than if I were like not from here, theoretically. So those are all the tension points I could say. There's a lot of beauty in the Discord, like the conflicting natures that make me not want to explain myself. I rarely ever do. I never feel the need to. So it is not like it is all negative, hypothetically, but it is still like if the goal was reconciliation, I would have to say like I don't think it's possible, and we need to shift away from trying really hard to fight, to me, against like a text that is never going to change and people's perceptions of that, and internal identity, which is always subject to your perspective.
Nas, do you want to go next or?
So I think in my situation, I think it's a bit different because I did kind of have my queer awakening really while in Jordan, and really not really in an American environment. So it's more like I was in a predominantly Muslim place where in Jordan, gay rights just are non-existent. Gay marriage has never been legalized there. And like to the point where I think when gay rights were legalized, or sorry, not gay rights, I mean same-sex marriage was legalized in the United States like a few years ago, we had the American ambassador in Jordan actually get really laughed out of the room when she tried to bring it up in front of Jordanian politicians. And really, queer people were the ones who faced the brunt of that. And I was a teenager when that happened as well, or in kind of a teenager, early university, but yeah. And that was kind of like the environment I kind of felt myself, you know, coming to terms with being queer in, and feeling that like can I really reconcile these two parts of myself, being Muslim and being queer? And like Amir said, just kind of not really feeling that you could reconcile them because, you know, on one hand, like I have all of these people who are like in positions of authority, people who have an authority over my life, my parents, my family, all of the adults in my life saying that like, no, these things can't really exist together. And obviously it's not something that I would ever bring up with them because it's something that I already know, that like I already know the answer to it. And another aspect of it to me as well is really the sort of like, in the same way that there is this kind of Islamophobia towards Muslims in the West, and this attitude that like Muslims are by default these really conservative, dogmatic, closed-minded people, there is a push against this kind of open-mindedness and progressiveness in the Middle East, specifically because it's considered a Western value, and this feeling of like, if you are, I guess, acquiescing to these kind of values, you are self-colonizing, or you are allying yourself with the West, and that sort of like wanting to distance yourself from the West, you know, making that resistance towards these progressive values, towards accepting that queer people exist even amongst, you know, Arabs and Muslims, that makes it really, really hard. So, you know, it's this feeling of like, if you are to talk about queer Muslims and queer Arabs existing, the prevailing attitude will be, well, they're just, you know, spending too much time on the internet, you know, looking at American media, watching American shows, and, you know, because they're putting all these gay characters on Netflix. And that's kind of something that I've had to struggle with. And it really wasn't until I kind of had more of a community around me of, you know, other queer Muslims and trans Muslims that I really felt that like, you know, I can be both. And it's not something that has to like be at odds with one another. And it is something that I've been feeling like I can try to merge those two. And I think, like I said in the previous question that was asked, like this feeling of like, well, you know, Allah loves me and Allah wanted me to be this way. And so would I be honoring God if I went against everything that was in my nature in order to like, you know, do what these, you know, maybe homophobic, transphobic, misogynistic sheikhs in like Saudi Arabia want me to do, you know? And so I've been trying to like learn more about the religion. And I know that like at some point, like this is a rigid text and there are some things that can be and some things that cannot be. And you kind of have to find a place in the middle, but try to kind of carve that space out really through knowledge, through kind of like that spiritual exploration. And it's kind of just an ongoing journey, and it's not really easy. And there's always kind of these moments of like, am I really doing the right thing here? Or is this the right path for me? But it's something that I really want to dedicate myself to.
Before I answer, I have a question for the group, which is, would anyone here be offended if I said anything that is like sacrilegious?
No.
No, I was actually thinking of getting into that later, so that's fine.
Okay, because I think my opinion would upset a lot of Muslims, so I just wanted to ask first. I think for me, despite living in Canada, actually my experience is very closer to Naz's experience because, like I said, I'm a first generation immigrant from Pakistan, and the way I always describe like my family environment and the culture that I grew up in is that it's like if Pakistan in the 90s was frozen in time forever. Right, because my parents' understanding of what Pakistani and Muslim culture is based off of from the last time they lived there, which was the 90s, right? Even though it is now 2025, like they don't know what Pakistan is like right now. They don't know how the culture has, you know, changed. They don't know how different kinds of understandings of Islamic practices have interacted with that cultural change and maybe have also changed themselves. Like they don't know about any of these shifts that have happened, really and truly. Like they can watch TV, they can talk to family that's still back there, but it's very different from living in it, right? And so I always say like it feels like I'm in a time capsule of like the 90s, and I think that really does affect like how culturally and religiously the interaction with queerness and transness happens. And so I actually like resonate really closely with what Naz was saying about this idea of like open-mindedness and progressivism being a very Western value, and you should actually openly and actively oppose it at all turns. That is what I grew up being told. That is what I'm constantly told even today, is like, anytime I bring up anything remotely like this, the idea is like, well, that's for white people, that's for Christians, like they do that. We don't do that. That is not our culture, that is not our religion, and it's actually our responsibility, despite living in this environment, to like actively not get influenced by that. And so, like, to the point where like I've tried to have conversations with my mother about like queerness and transness, like not in regards to me, that's not even remotely safe, but just kind of in the abstract, right? Like I've tried to be like, oh, well, like queer Muslims exist. What about that? Like, how do you feel about that? And the answer is always like, well, they're wrong. Like that's you can't do that. And so for me, and here's where like the sacrilege comes in, is that I do think that there is inherent tension there. And I agree that that can't be reconciled. And for me, a lot of that comes from, I think, like Amir, you mentioned earlier, this idea of like the Quran being an unedited text. I actually don't believe that. I actually think that is just a thing Muslims tell each other because we want to be seen as the like top dog religion. We want to be seen as more legitimate than Christianity and Judaism because those texts have been edited, but ours hasn't, right? Like that's what I was taught growing up and even today, right? And I don't believe that personally. I do think that the Quran has been, I don't believe it is the exact word for word recitation of the word of God. I don't believe that. I do believe it has been like altered and affected and influenced by people, by the men who wrote the Quran and have since passed it down. Whether or not that has been altered from the day that it was written, I don't know. But I don't believe that this is word for word exactly what God said and wanted. I do think it is a cultural artifact. It is a historical artifact that very specifically collects ideas and dogmas from a specific time and place. And I think we actually do ourselves as Muslims a disservice by not allowing it to change, because then we are mooring ourselves to a historical past, culturally speaking, and saying, this is forever the beliefs we should have, the cultures we should have, and we should never stray from that ever. And I think that is the enemy of like any sort of like humanitarian progress, because we all know that like, different like bigotries are normalized across different historical time points, and over time ideally we learn that those are wrong and we move on and we readjust, right? We go, actually that's not okay, like let's readjust our cultural understanding. But we can't do that if we are holding on to a historical text from a specific time and place that has very specific bigotries written into it that people won't move from. And so for me personally, like I've never, and this is just personal experience, like I've never met an older Muslim, like from my parents' generation or older, that has not been homophobic. I just haven't. Or transphobic. They've all like expressed homophobic and transphobic viewpoints. I've never been to a masjid that like had progressive viewpoints on this issue either. And so for me personally, it's really hard to see like when people hold on to this very rigid idea of what Islam is, like I see it really difficult to see that as something that can allow for the inclusion of like queer and trans Muslims in those spaces, because inherently it can't. And so for me, really, I think it's one of those things of like, I believe that as a religion, we need to just let go of the text. I think we need to hold it more loosely, and we need to reinterpret and even like rewrite. And that's the sacrilegious part, right? I think we need to rewrite some parts and be like, actually, maybe these are not okay anymore for us to think, and they weren't okay at the time for us to think, and we're moving on and we're building a more inclusive Islam underneath it. I think that until we can do that, like I don't see that tension getting resolved, because again, people are just so like clinging on to specific words that they believe come from the mouth of God, right? And like you can't argue with God.
I have actually something to say in that manner, because I guess you warned, but now I'm thinking it's not necessarily in my opinion sacrilegious to have that opinion, because I think having respect for the origin of that text and then its context surrounding it is something that is lost on people who are, like as you said, like older and probably dogmatic in that way, that revere it as opposed to analyze it, because I think this potential tension of like Western versus Eastern values that are inevitably going to make the conversation difficult, from maybe an American anxiety that I can share, is that I think lots of Muslims have critiques about the Quran and will not agree with every single thing. There are conservative viewpoints, and I don't meet a lot of progressive Muslims in my local area, at least, but like views on women's rights, child marriage, things that a lot of non-Muslims use to point and call Muslims barbaric because the optics are so terrible, due to, in part, like post 9/11 culture being ready to inflame the tensions that just other Muslims, as opposed to like integrate them into the culture, means that like if Muslims do want to like have a critical thought process or a discussion around like what they actually might disagree with, I think sacrilege to an individual is, of course, very important, but I cannot see where these conversations can happen, especially in a digital space where people with their biases against Muslims are always going to be thinking like, oh, well, this is your fault for being Muslim and believing in this. This is a barbaric culture that you are participating in. And it's really frustrating because I think a lot of older Muslims, whether or not they're doing it consciously or not, they are afraid of disrupting the imperial hegemony that just allows them to be there, but it is also a danger to them, just on the virtue of being Muslim and potentially being perceived as dangerous or terrorists, which, of course, maybe is more obvious to people nowadays, but it doesn't require you to necessarily be progressive for you to be viewed as like against America specifically. And America as that superpower, I think, will probably continue to dominate the conversation for as long as Islamophobia in particular is always like the reaction to Muslims having any sort of emotion, whether it is anger at their culture or their inability to be themselves, or the political reality of being a Muslim and the anger at the world, which, of course, having anger and all of these things trying to intersect is very difficult. And me as a Muslim personally, I do my best to not express anger, in part because of those stereotypes and the fear associated with that and being perceived as a danger. So
I do
yeah.
think that that is a very specific like American context though, and
Yes, I
that like
wanted to
doesn't
frame it that
apply
way.
yeah everywhere else. And like you said, like I think this conversation does need to be like an internal conversation, right? Like it cannot have input from like non-Muslims at all because like you said, yeah, it's like hard to express critiques of a thing that everywhere else is stereotyping and taking in bad faith and racist and Islamophobic beliefs abound, and that makes it really hard, like you said, to have these conversations because then yeah we become defensive because we're like, well, okay, we need to defend against all of that, and we can't do that and have these critical conversations at the same time. So I agree that it needs to be like a closed conversation. But for me, like there's so much potential there because not to point to Christianity, but for all that like Christianity has done to the world, also the one thing I point to and I look at as positive is that they do have so much critical discussion about the Bible and different interpretations of the Bible. And because of that, there's like so many different sects of Christianity at this point, and they all disagree and agree on different things. And, they have that. And we haven't largely been allowing ourselves to do that as Muslims, right? We have, I think, like three, correct me if I'm wrong, but like three major branches of Islam at this point, right? We have Sunni, Shia, and then like Sufi, right? And those are the three kind of main things. And even then, even within that, like the majority of Muslims are usually Sunni. At that point, even like Shia Muslims are a relative minority, globally speaking. And so like I think that there's so much potential there to like talk about our interpretations of the Quran, but also our relationship to the religion and like what we want it to look like. And I think we do ourselves a disservice by not having that conversation. I just think that like it's ahistorical to also say that we can't ever change anything because we have historical examples of specific like sects of Islam being influenced by and influencing other spiritual beliefs and other spiritual people as well. So yeah, all to say, I think we should talk more. That's all.
I do want to add a little bit of my history in here, which is that my queerness and Muslimness have long been in not exactly arm in arm with one another. You know, I remember being a teenager and like looking up gay Muslims on the internet. And this is like 2004, right? And just seeing like reinforcements of that's not a fucking thing, go die. You know what I mean? Like seeing that kind of stuff. And that really, you know, like early made me be like, well, I guess there's no place for me. So for a really long time, I did not claim to be Muslim. I said I was raised Muslim and left it at that because I felt like, you know, like obviously if I'm not allowed in your club, I'm not gonna fight to be in it. You know what I mean? If you don't want me here, I don't need to be here. I'll go where the party's at, which is wherever I am, you know? But maybe 10 years ago, 2015-ish, like I started seeing queer Muslims on Twitter and being like, holy shit, are we allowed to do this? You know, like there are others. And that really like did something for and to me. And obviously, like I have a lot of stuff that just doesn't mesh with my personal beliefs. And what brought me back to calling myself Muslim was the year 2016, when I determined that it doesn't matter if I consider myself Muslim or not. The people who hate Muslims and want to kill them want to kill me. So I might as fucking well claim that title. And I've held it ever since. And, you know, it means whatever I decide it means for me. But that doesn't mean that the greater culture is going to be with me on that, you know? So anyway, let's move to the next question. This is some good stuff. We might have to convene another time personally and just talk about shit. I'm really enjoying hearing y'all's answers. So let's go into a little bit of a TTRPG zone. How do you feel being Muslim influences your experience of TTRPGs? And that includes game design, gameplay, actual play, social interactions, whatever.
Probably go first again. I have a much shorter answer, I think, in that Islam's largely not talked about. It is not brought up unless other people specifically want to incorporate Middle Eastern aesthetics into their fantasy worlds. I mostly just work with sensitivity reading for other people, and I play like a lot of the major games that like Western creators have, so to speak. So the only way I'm able to infuse myself is like in character work, which I respect and appreciate. I don't really know who it reaches or connects to, but it's fine. I feel like there really isn't a desire in the space for Islam to exist as a thematic parallel to Christianity, because like when people talk about things like religious themes, they're talking about Christian themes. They talk about hell, and I know they don't mean anything about Judaism, for example. And then anything else associated with like specifically Christian practices and also Orientalism makes me infer that they're not talking about Islam either. So it largely just makes me feel like I don't like being a Muslim is an adjective for people to look at in my bio, and then they invite me to tables or something. And then that's the extent of it.
I can say on my end, I also don't have quite a long answer to this either. My experience mainly with TTRPGs is mostly as a player and as a game master. I don't really have much in the way of like, you know, game development or live plays or anything of, you know, a similar sort. But I think, like Nada said, that where I kind of infuse that is, yeah, like in character work, when I'm the game master of a particular campaign, I try to kind of make sure that like there is that diversity in religion, even if like it's a completely fictionalized setting. Islam doesn't exist, Christianity doesn't exist, but it's not like that the default religion is just like some Christian adjacent religion, because that tends to happen in TTRPG settings where it's like it's not called Christianity, but it is Christianity, you know. And so I've tried to kind of move away from that. And yeah, as well, like with my own characters as a player, I have found that I've been quite fortunate, at least in the games that I have joined in on, in the game masters, especially if they've been white people, I've been fortunate that they've kind of not been very like, they didn't really like push back against me really exploring my cultural identity, whether that's, being Palestinian and being Arab, or whether that's, being a Muslim. And so even to the point where like I'm currently participating in a game of Dungeons and Dragons, at least, where I've kind of just carved out an entire like sort of Palestinian community inside the GM setting, where it's just like they're just Palestinians existing there. And I kind of get to like do that, even though they're not really called that, of course. And I try to kind of do that or experience that, because beforehand, whenever I was experiencing any kind of game, I would move away from these parts of my identity that used to really make me feel, like I was not in vogue, I guess I want to say, like, nobody wanted to do that. That's not interesting. And I'm like, well, we can make it interesting, but we have to have our voices in the room when things are being done. So yeah, that's kind of my take on it, at least.
I don't know if anybody else has ever felt this way, but for me, I feel like I'm not allowed to touch Islam in tabletop settings, not because of Islamophobia, but because of the teachings of Islam. I don't know if anybody else has ever felt that. Like, I grew up being like, it hammered into me that, like, this is all very sacred, and like, we're not allowed to like depict any of these people or any of these things in any way. Like this is all highly, highly sacred text and stories and things like that. And so for me, I actually feel like weird about even trying to put it into a story, because I feel like I'm not like that delegitimizes it or in some way like is sacrilegious, or like like I feel like I'm doing something wrong if I put it into a story. And so largely I don't, because it just feels odd. And the most I've ever done really is that there's this Islamic folk tale that I like stumbled upon about Shaitan and how he has these 5 children that are all like have different domains that they're responsible for. And I brought that to an AP, and I was like, hey, I kind of want to play this out, and I want to play one of like the devil's children. And so in that one, I'm playing Misfit, who is like his domain is lies, and so he handles that. And so that is like the most that I'm exploring that. But by and large, I'm like, I don't know, like I don't know if I'm allowed to like put any of these like people or their stories into like a tabletop game and explore it, and like what would that even look like for me. And also, I think there's this tension too of like, I actually don't really see, at least in my tables and the stories I've been a part of, I don't actually really see Christian adjacent, like religious exploration in a lot of the games I'm in. I actually see a lot of polytheistic exploration of religion instead. So it's actually not even Christian, it's actually rather pagan, or in some ways, depending on what table I'm in, like kind of like Hindu kind of like inspiration that's happening there. And so for me, I feel actually quite difficult to fully be able to bring my culture into those tables, because I don't come from a polytheistic religion or culture, right? And so like, for example, I'm in an actual play called Sacred Machinations. And during session 0, we were told that like the idea for this show is that they really wanted to highlight gods from different non-Christian religions. And so they asked us to like bring forward like our cultural gods and to play characters who had some sort of relationship with a cultural god. But the thing is that, Islam is basically like Christianity in that way. We only have the one god and we don't have multiple gods. And so I showed up and I was like, I don't have a god I can pull from for this game. Like, I really want to be here at this table, but I don't really know what I could do. And then it was expanded out to, okay, that's okay. We can do like cultural like monsters and things like that. And then I still felt weird because I was like, well, the only cultural monster we really have is like jinnis, like is jinns, right? And I was like, that's also kind of strange because they're like, I don't know, again, that kind of like upbringing I had about like you're not supposed to like trivialize these things or like play with them kind of came in, where I was like, oh, would it be wrong of me to play a character who worshipped a jinn and like had a relationship with a jinn? I don't know, that felt so weird to me as a concept, so I didn't do it. And I think the fact that, like, at least from my understanding, like there aren't really like folk tales in Islam very much. It is very just like God and the prophets and that's it. And there's no magic and fantastical like beings or anything like that other than like jinns, which are their own kind of thing. And then like because Pakistan as a culture is also just so heavily like just the culture is really just Islam, right? Because partition split away the like Hindu influences, which I have so many other complicated feelings about, but that's like not relevant to this panel. But like any Hindu influences that like I could theoretically claim as part of my heritage before, the colonial partition, whatever, etc., got excised. And so pretty much all of the Pakistani culture is really just Muslim culture. And so because we don't have like monsters and like fantastical beings and things like that to play with, I felt very alienated at first because I was like, not on purpose, not because anybody at the table was doing that, but just by the nature of like, we were being asked to bring something from our personal experience. And I was like, actually, my personal experience doesn't make sense in this context. And so I actually just ended up not doing that. And I was like, I'll just pick a concept instead, and that'll be what I do. And so for me, it's actually really interesting because I feel this tension of both like, stories not being set up in a way that even allows me necessarily to like lean into like Muslim influence into the story, but also from the other side of it, just internally, I feel like this barrier of like it would be somehow wrong to explore that in a story, and so I don't, because of kind of those two forces operating in tandem. Yeah, I don't know if that's like something anyone else has ever felt, but that's kind of been my experience.
I want to say that, like, yeah, I definitely have had that feeling, and not just in tabletop, but also because I, aside from TTRPG, I do also write my own original fiction, and that was something that, like, at a really young age, like writing like little stories back when like Twilight was really popular, and I wanted to write my own little vampire story, but like I wanted the vampires to be Muslim, and I like had that moment of like, can vampires be Muslim? And the answer is no, you're not allowed to drink blood in Islam, but I did it anyway. But like in TTRPG, that is also, like you mentioned about like gods and us like only really having the one god, and that is also another thing that I've really experienced, of like polytheism being really also majorly explored in TTRPGs, but not necessarily monotheism. And so I've also really felt that like sometimes when I've been planning for sessions, when I've been a game master and working on my homebrew universe, where I've just been like, do I draw from like the pre-Islamic gods of like those Arab gods that like there's all the stories in the Quran about like how you should not worship these gods, and if you do, you will be damned to hell forever, and how like they had to go and like destroy all the idols in Mecca and all that, and like, do I bring those up, or will I be damned to hell for eternity?
No,
What is
literally.
like but yeah, no, totally, I totally get it. So yeah, you're not alone in that.
Yeah, and for me, it's like this added kind of layer on top of that, where it's like I love, first of all, I love exploring polytheism in tabletops. I think it's really fun to create a pantheon and everything. But when I'm thinking about like, okay, how do I personalize it? That's when I'm like, wait, what is going on? Because like on top of the layer of like, am I doing something wrong by pulling from pre-Islamic culture? I think for me, the added kind of layer to that is technically Pakistan doesn't have a pre-Islamic culture that is Pakistani, right? Like the pre-Islamic culture truly would be from either one of two places. It would either be India, so I would be pulling from like Hindu and like that history, or it would be from the Ottoman Empire, in which case I would be pulling from Arab cultures, right? Particularly like Iraq, in particular, from that. And that also feels weird to me because I'm like, am I allowed to do that? Because like technically, historically speaking, that is my lineage, right? Both of those things are my lineage. My family history, if you were to trace it far back enough, goes to both of those places. But modern wise, I say I'm from Pakistan. Like, am I allowed to pull from Indian and like Arab, like pre-Islamic histories? And then that feels weird because I'm like, am I doing a racism by doing that actually? Because they're not technically like where I'm from, but like, and that's where we get into the discussion that is not relevant about like colonial borders and all of that stuff and how that influences culture and our understandings of identity. But that is a tangent, so we're not gonna go there. But yeah, all to say, it feels very complicated to me in terms of like exploring Islam like in tabletop narratives.
There's something to me that feels like it feels less like the it's not so much the non-Muslim people will have whatever kind of reaction. It's what are the Muslim people gonna say? What are the Arabs gonna say? You know what I mean? Like we have all seen some fairly conservative stuff, and I've always kind of felt like that if I'm living out loud like on the internet or whatever, like whose evil eye am I gonna draw? Who is, you know what I mean? Like who's gonna get mad at me? How is this gonna make me unsafe? And that's an ongoing question, I guess. Let's go to our next one. What changes do you hope for and or are working toward with regard to the representation and treatment of Muslims in these TTRPG spaces?
I can go first again. It's also relatively like simple answer, which with a large cultural overtone is that there needs to be more Muslim voices, precisely so that like this idea of there being like one perspective about the rigidity of the religion and how that influences the culture can like dissolve for one, because I think honestly we kind of do this space a disservice for not letting straight Muslims and queer Muslims like coincide and like talk about how their faith like intermingles and conflicts and all that, because
Are
it's
you
viewed
suggesting
as
a part two to this panel? Sorry.
hey. I've been doing this occasionally. This is where I think we're making good time, but of course we can talk about anything and everything. But the what I was saying before I got that is that the barrier to like having more Muslims is to like be interested in Muslim stories. And I think that is a big ask for like a largely non-Muslim population as a whole that sort of sees Islam as like a sequel to Christianity. And since they think they know everything about Christianity, there's like not a lot of curiosity to explore like, okay, what's different about Islam? And then what is similar and what is worth exploring in terms of, because I think there are a lot of themes and some, moral teachings about like what it means to be a good person, what it means to be in community that can be taken out of the literal context that they stem from, and that maybe other people that are less progressive think that it has to be the literal context always, and that's why things are never going to change. But like they're like the big answer is of course like we need like a reckoning with a lot of people's like internal biases against Islam, and why is the thing that is interesting, things like polytheistic world building and maybe Christian themes, because that goes into a whole conversation about like what's marketable and whatnot. And I think Islam as a whole is not like a very marketable topic, maybe because of that tension between Eastern and Western values and all that. But yeah, it is also, in my experience, hard to invite Muslims into the space because of like the whole fantasy play. Like I tried to do that a bit when I was younger with Muslim friends, and they would do things like play video games and like indulge in like Western media, but the satanic panic sort of like still had an effect, not in the way that I think nerds typically associate it with, but just like depictions of devils and multiple gods as being like a sort of sacrilege can be a barrier if you don't trust like the people that you want to bring the hobby to. So it's like it's just a long road of like slowly roping people in with trying to have an open mind to this sort of thing, I think.
I think for me, the answer is far more political. I agree with what Netta said, cosign. But also, I think on more of like a metatextual kind of, not at the table, but like everything that happens around the table kind of thing. So in the industry and things like that, I think we need to adopt BDS wholesale across the board. I think literally every single tabletop company, every single person working in the industry needs to adopt BDS as like a bare minimum stance moving forward, because as some of you may know, I was one half of organizing the Big Bad Boycott alongside Esther due to their censorship of pro Palestinian speech from last year's convention. And during that process, it was made really stark to me just how little value Muslim lives, and in particular Palestinian lives, like really had in the space and in the industry at large, like to the point where it has become like just a talking point, right? Just like a intellectual exercise that people don't really think about very very closely. And so for me, like, asking people to do the bare minimum, which was maybe promise to not go to a convention that refuses to keep the protection of Palestinians and of Muslims and of anti-Zionist Jewish people at its sort of forefront as a core value. To me, that was such a bare minimum ask, and a lot of people tripped over that bar. And so it really brought into plain view that though there is a lot of progressive talk in the industry, there is not a lot of progressive action. And so for me, really, I just need to see people actually step up, like for real, and do the actual work that people say that they support in theory, but unless you're actually actively doing it, I don't really believe you. Because I heard a lot of, things like, well, we're just doing games, silly little games, this doesn't matter, we're not going to have a big impact, how is this relevant, kind of thing. And I'm like, no, it is relevant actually, like these kinds of politics affect every facet of our lives, whether you want them to or not. And while you as a non-Muslim, non-Palestinian, non-anti-Zionist Jew like may not feel it because it doesn't impact you, it impacts those of us that are directly affected by these issues. And so whether you realize it or not, you are truly making a political decision, taking a political action by choosing not to. And I would really love to see more like critical thinking, like introspection about that, about like where people stand on that, what people think, and then to do the work of actually taking those steps, as difficult as they may feel, as scary as they may feel. It is still, I strongly believe, our obligation to participate. And so if you're watching this and you are part of a company or something like that in the tabletop industry, even as an individual selling games or things like that, or performing professionally in the space in the industry, this is my call to you specific. I'm talking to you. You're like, oh no, they're not talking to me. No, I'm talking to you. I need you to participate in BDS and to do so publicly and vocally.
On that note, actually, and I'm really glad you brought that up, really, Hamna, is I really, really 100% agree. And especially like as a Palestinian myself, that is something that I've really, really thought about, because it's, and I know that like that in some ways kind of like diverges from the like topic of Islam in particular, but like as a Palestinian Muslim, it is something that is like a sort of like a barrier of entry for me when I go into a space and I feel like, well, these people are totally okay with my people being killed, And I don't know if we're allowed to bring up specific companies or things like that, but there is a production studio that does actual plays. And I was really happy to see that a lot of their members, and I'm sure this can be said for a lot of different actual plays, but I don't consume them as much as other people might, where like the players and the GMs are like actively and vocally like participating in protests and, BDS and all of these things. And that is something that like, I guess growing up and having, Palestine be something that is like people kind of joke about, but don't really like actively support. The last 2 years has been really, really weird for me in a good way, that like it's getting a lot more focus and attention. And like seeing that people like support that, like that actually like was very strange for me. And seeing, especially in the tabletop space, people be very vocally pro-Palestine and anti-Zionist, that made me really feel more welcomed in these spaces, because I felt like, well, okay, I'm actually allowed to be here. People don't actually like, they see me as like a person and not necessarily as like this inconvenience where, these kind of topics can really be people can really treat them as like something like really inconvenient, and they still do, to be fair. Like, you can bring up Palestine to somebody who is really largely indifferent on the matter, and they will be like, oh, you're bringing that up again, and like it's like an inconvenience, or it's something that's not as big a deal as people make it out to be, when it absolutely is. But I can also kind of agree with what Nada was talking about earlier, in that like there is also like a barrier on the side of Arabs and Muslims, or and also not just Arabs, Muslims of all different ethnicities and backgrounds, where there is that kind of feeling of like they don't really want to enter these spaces because they feel either they'll be disrespected or they'll feel that it's sacrilegious. If I talk to my parents about like, oh, I'm going to go play Dungeons and Dragons, or I'm going to go play some other tabletop game here, if I want to like talk to them about what's going on, like I do feel myself consciously omitting the parts where I'm like, oh, there's like a devil pact, and, we did like some weird satanic ritual, because you can do that in tabletop and it not be a big deal. Or like I leave out the polytheism, which is like a major part of like a lot of tabletop games, because I know that that's not the audience for this kind of topic. And so you really have to find that audience to bring more of Muslims into these spaces to really, I guess, enrich them with their own experiences. And yeah, you have to kind of meet them in the middle somehow, and also like show them that like this is not that bad. This is like, we're all really just playing pretend and improv at this point, but you have to like be able to take it slowly with these people who kind of see it as like some strange Western evil thing.
So we've got about 10 minutes left. So let's see what we can do. I'm sure, like a couple of minutes here, that will be fine. What does being Muslim mean to you now? What makes you Muslim? And that's a big question, I know. So answer it to whatever level you want. For me, being Muslim, like the thing is that in Islam, when Allah created us, they called a fucking news conference to tell the angels and to tell the jinn and everything. And they were like, look at my creation, like so proud. And that we in the hierarchy of the universe are above the angels to God. That is one of the things that makes me Muslim. That's one of the things that I reflect on. And I think, like on the topic of like sacrilege, I'm not fully sure there is a God. But if there is one, if I was intentionally created, I was created by a creator who was proud of me and who loved me and who made me the way that I am. So like, you can say whatever you want about us queers and fags and etc. But we're here and we got made just like you did. So fucking deal with it. Anybody else?
Oh, I'm co-signing that. I was like gonna say pretty much a similar thing, but maybe like a layer there is that living in the present as a Muslim is like a continual exercise in stepping away from the past as it literally gets farther and farther away. And there is an inherent struggle, I guess, in the political reality as of right now. And struggle, with all of its negative connotation, is something that can be fruitful when it comes to exploring yourself. So having Islam as a sort of mirror to myself is way more illuminating than Islam as like the parental wagging of the finger telling me this is how it should be, and then that being what controls my life. I think every attempt that I've had to do something like to change myself to be a better Muslim that has resulted in self-harm in a way, like I didn't actually go into it. Like I cannot fast. It has given me disordered eating for life, I think. So now I have to take that and realize like what Islam says about how we treat disabled people, and in turn how we should treat vulnerable people, means that I am allowed grace even if there's not like a doctor telling me I'm disabled, in a way that I'm allowed to not be rigid specifically because God said so, if that was his intention. Because I want to believe even if he isn't all like omni, like even if he intends to be kind and cannot always be kind, that if he exists, like the sort of caveat, if he exists, then he doesn't want us twisting ourselves into like an acceptable form for mostly other people's benefits. It is not really a spiritual practice that I find does anything but let guilt and self-flagellation fester. And, I'm sure that can be a common thing among people of many religious denominations that use guilt in that way to want to change themselves. So yeah, it is a good struggle, I think.
I also would like to kind of build on that, and also what Faders mentioned about God, loving us and being proud of us. And that is something that at the top of this kind of panel I mentioned about the hadith of like God loving you more than, more, a mother loves her child. And that is something that I continue to take with me. And it's just been guiding me this whole time. And to more on what Nada mentioned about struggle, that is something that I've also kind of really contemplated on struggle, because that is in Islam the concept of jihad. And that is something that like Western people really take out of context, because they hear jihad and they think of like, militants and, suicide bombers and whatever they want to think about it. But really, the kind of core of jihad is when you struggle in order to make life for yourself and the people around you a better place, whether that is through being a soldier through war, or whether that is through being a teacher and struggling in order to bring, knowledge and enlightenment to the children and make their lives better. And that is something that I've kind of like contemplated on, because I always think that like, and especially like in things like related to my spiritual struggles, my struggles accepting myself as a queer Muslim, but also like mental health in particular. I won't get into like the details, of course, but just that is something like where you kind of sit there and like, taking care of myself on a day-to-day basis and giving myself grace, that is a form of jihad, where I'm like, if living to see the next day, that is a form of jihad, because I am doing that not just for myself but for God, that I want to improve my life, be happy, and improve the lives of the people around me. And I do that within the framework of Islam, and with the knowledge that like God is watching me, but he's also proud of me and he wants me to succeed. And that is something that really guides my life.
For me, I think being Muslim now is very much both a personal and a communal thing. Like, I think the community of it all is what really prevents me from severing that tie, right? Despite all of the tensions that I experienced, despite all of the ways in which it would be quite easy theoretically to just kind of be like, you know what, like I'm not actually Muslim. I still have always felt this kind of like pull to it for some reason. And I think a lot of that really does come from the cultural and communal aspects, right? I'm not going to turn my back on, a history, my people, like my culture, like my community. And I think honestly, it's that pulls me through. And I think that there is something very Islamic in that as a teaching, right? As a loving of other people. And for me, that sort of more flexible view of what it means to be Muslim has really helped me to be able to not reconcile, but like be able to kind of like be more comfortable with it as a identity, right? Like learning about the actual true history, right? Like I've been so enamored by Sufi teachings in particular now, because like learning that this was a sect that did do a lot of cultural exchange with other religions. That to me was just so fascinating, and to see that there is potential in the history, right? That there are pieces of our history that we just, I think, don't talk about. I think that to me is a I'm probably using it incorrectly, and some tabletop designer is going to go mad at me for it, but like that to me is a fruitful void of like my relationship to Islam, in the sense that I sit here and I look at the things we're not talking about, and I look at the things that we have no records of as far as I've been able to find. And it makes me wonder, right? I always sit here and I think and I go, where are my queer ancestors? Where are they? They exist. They definitely exist, but where are they? Right? We haven't talked about them. Where are my trans ancestors? And I like to think that, if they could exist and be a part of this community in some way, then like so can I.
That's really beautiful. Y'all, this has been a really good conversation. Hopefully it's an ongoing one. I've really enjoyed hearing from all of you, meeting all of you. This was dope. Thank you so much. Right quick, if you're interested in like sharing your ats or any of the projects that you're currently working on, please do so.
I can go first one last time. Netta and Amir, and or mostly just on Blue Sky, not on Twitter. I should have said that beforehand. On Tall Rowlets, I'll probably like have that in the description as well. Currently ongoing AP release with Hamna, which she can obviously speak more on. I put my slightly Muslim character in there as an example with honestly one of my favorite episodes of all time that was just most recently aired about conflict, let's say, and how I'm not going to actually say anything more about it because otherwise I'm not doing too much. And that's okay because we all need to slow down, I think, a little bit, give ourselves more of that grace. So I'll pass it to whoever wants to shout themselves out.
I guess it makes sense since you mentioned the show that I can go next and actually talk about it. So the audience is not holding their breath for a long time. Hello, everyone. My name is Hamna. I use any and all pronouns, and I am a TTRPG performer and producer. You can find me all over the internets at Lilith TTRPG, though I am most active on Blue Sky, so that's probably the best place to go. I'm also the executive director of Tender Vicious Studios, which is a multimedia production studio that makes experimental art with intent. You can find us all over the internet at tendervicious.com or at Tender Vicious Studios. And coming out of the studio, we have a actual play audio drama podcast right now called Laurie's House. It is a story about imperfect memory, identity, and community. It is really good, if I do say so myself, so you should go check it out. And the game that we play in Laurie's House is called The Home We Remember, and the Ashcan edition of that game is out right now. We published it in partnership with Frivolous Bear Studios, and you can find that at frivolousbearstudios.com. So please go get a copy of the game if you can and check out the show.
Once again, I'm Feiruz, she, they, and you can find me mostly, on Blue Sky, Tumblr for like shit posting. Honestly, Blue Sky for shit posting too. At Feiru, FAIROUXX. Naz, would you like to drop an at, or are we good?
I can drop an at, sure. I'm mostly active on Blue Sky and Tumblr, though not very much on Tumblr anymore. So on Tumblr, I am Nabulsi at Nabulsi, NABULSI. And on Blue Sky, I am Neiruz, so just my name, NAIRUZ. But I mostly, like on Tumblr, I mostly post fundraising, things like that. And on Blue Sky, it is shit posting mostly and fandom stuff. As for any current projects I'm working on, not at the moment, but I am quite active in the Discord server for Quasar, Tales from the Endless Void, which is a Palestinian-made TTRPG system. And I am one of the playtesters and am currently GMing games also on the server. So if anyone is interested in trying out a new sci-fi TTRPG, this one is still in beta and the community is really active and really inclusive and really fun. So yeah.
That sounds dope. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here today, this Jumu'ah that we're sharing. It's been real, it's been great, and I hope that we can continue this conversation.